Strategic warning has been a key or an elementary part of the intelligence enterprise since the advent of nuclear weapons. Intelligence services in nuclear-armed states, one of their key preoccupations has been deciphering the nuclear intentions of an adversary with the key task of predicting or warning of potential nuclear attack or military attack that could produce nuclear escalation. In contemporary conflict, evidently, intelligence agencies, like many other actors, are preoccupied with the potential for escalation, including the nuclear escalation of conflicts such as the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in the Middle East, and the prospective war in the Taiwan Strait. The starting point of my intervention here today is posing the question about the relationship between strategic deterrence and strategic warning. What is the relationship? Does success in one entail success in the other? And what are the implications in terms of linking warning intelligence and strategic deterrence policy? Most people will depict the contemporary war in Ukraine as a significant intelligence warning success. But I would like to pose some questions regarding that in light of the still substantive debate about whether Ukraine can be constituted as a deterrence success or a deterrence failure. I'll spell out some reflections drawing on the delineation in the strategic nuclear literature relating to the difference between general and immediate deterrence, where general deterrence relates to sustaining an ability to deter the adversary in peacetime from contemplating aggression against you, and where immediate deterrence relates to sustaining an ability to potentially deter the adversary from perpetrating aggression or further escalation in a period of increased hostility or in wartime. So a delineation between peacetime deterrence and wartime deterrence. I'll make the case that this delineation between general and immediate deterrence could also be of use to analyze warning problems and warning success or failure, where general intelligence warning relates to shifts in the way the adversary may contemplate aggression, and immediate warning relates to warning of decisions or deliberations about the pursuit of political objectives through forceful means, including nuclear weapons. I'll speak to these two sets of challenges, and then I'll illustrate this with some examples from Ukraine. So first, relating to general deterrence and warning. General deterrence relates to the strategic balance of forces between nuclear-armed adversaries. A standard definition of general deterrence describes an adversarial relationship between two states in which leaders in at least one would consider resorting to force to alter the status quo, and the other side, precisely because it believes the opponent would be willing to consider resorting to force, will maintain forces of its own and offer warnings to respond in kind to any attempt to use force contrary to their interests. It's about upholding or developing a nuclear force posture, that is, capabilities, signaling, or communication that conveys clearly and effectively and persuasively to an adversary your nuclear intentions and your threats to use nuclear weapons in response to certain type of aggression. It's about convincing an adversary on a general or a day-to-day basis that contemplating such aggression is a bad idea because the costs it will incur will outweigh any potential benefit. General deterrence therefore characterizes a situation where the adversaries are neither using military force nor actively threatening the use of force, which brings us to the intelligence warning literature deliberation of what constitutes an actual warning problem. Does it have to entail a decision already taken to initiate some type of hostility or not? Regardless of such conceptual debate, a key intelligence warning problem has remained associated with this general deterrence problem: tracking, tracing, understanding key developments in the nuclear posture of the adversary. During the Cold War, this challenge was associated quite closely with the task of identifying whether an adversary was pursuing nuclear superiority or an ability to conduct a disarming strike on your nuclear weapons that would leave you defenseless. And this may sound like a historical or sort of a far-fetched idea, for example, in the context of the contemporary US-Russian relationship, where both sides retain a substantive nuclear arsenal of several thousand nuclear weapons. But it remains an acute and pressing problem, as indicated, for example, by the way Russia today is developing and fielding a suite of new exotic nuclear weapon systems that are designed specifically to overcome a potential vulnerability that they perceive from a combined nuclear and conventional disarming strike from the United States. General warning in the nuclear realm also relates to warning of a change in the nuclear intentions of an adversary. This includes understanding the sources of an adversary's foreign policy behavior, the ways in which that adversary will be willing to put their nuclear weapons to use to pursue specific foreign policy objectives. Nuclear capabilities alone do not necessarily convey a willingness to use or, for example, employ newly acquired nuclear weapons capabilities. And many would claim that deciphering intentions in the nuclear realm are particularly tricky, given the poor empirical record that we have of decisions to use nuclear weapons. Fortunately, that track record is very poor. This means that we have few guiding principles to help us delineate intentions to threaten nuclear use from intentions to actually carry through that intent. The second type of deterrence challenge and warning challenge is, that I mentioned that I want to introduce is the immediate deterrence and warning challenge, which scholars such as Huth and Russell describe through the following conditions. First, that officials in at least one of the countries are actively considering launching an attack on the other or one of its allies. Second, that leaders in the other state are actually aware of this. And third, that the latter, to prevent an attack, will issue threats to retaliate. These threats or warnings can be communicated by official statements, by other communication, or by overt military actions, ranging from border reinforcements to large-scale mobilization. The immediate warning problem that's related to this immediate deterrence challenge is much more straightforward, and it is evident that intelligence will play a key role in this challenge. Information and assessments relating to the deliberation of such an attack, the means and ways of such an attack, will be endemic to formulating a potential response that can potentially deter that type of attack. As such, in the case of immediate deterrence, we can talk about an intimate relationship between warning success and that being a prerequisite for deterrence success, as opposed to the general deterrence problem where the relationship between warning and deterrence success may be more complicated. So this simple analytical setup or duality lends itself to an examination of some of the empirical evidence from the Ukraine war, and we could use this setup to examine other empirical examples such as the Hamas attack, for example, but I will leave that aside. So I have three examples from the Ukraine war. The first one being a controversial claim that the Ukraine war demonstrates an example of general deterrence failure as well as general warning failure, with regard to perceiving and tracking and warning of the shift in Russian intentions vis-à-vis Ukraine. This, of course, depends on how you frame the deterrence problem in the first place. If the deterrence problem was that of deterring Russian aggression and use of force against another state, then the Ukraine case constitutes a deterrence failure. Furthermore, one could make the case that Ukraine was also a general warning failure in terms of predicting the turn or twist in the Russian leadership's calculus regarding its position vis-à-vis Ukraine. This warning failure could be constituted as one that the West in general has encountered twice. First, in 2014, when the Russian operation in Crimea caught most people by surprise, including the fact that the Russians were willing to annex a significant part of the territory of a neighboring state. And then we encountered the warning failure, the general warning failure, again, in the period before 2022, engorging the severity of the shift in the Russian calculus. The debate on deciphering Russian intentions, including the nuclear domain, had been going on for some time and was going on in this entire period, and on whether Russia would contemplate pursuing coercive objectives vis-à-vis its neighbors with the use of nuclear weapons. But most people were focusing on the Baltics and on NATO rather than on, for example, Ukraine. But this debate was not concluded, and the jury still remains out on this question of whether Russia would be willing to use nuclear weapons to pursue its compelling objectives in Ukraine. It has not been willing to do so far. The question remains about whether we're understanding the Russian calculus, also with regard to the utility of nuclear weapons in Russian doctrine. For example, there may be lessons to the limits to the kinds of lessons which should be drawing from Ukraine in understanding Russian nuclear strategy, also in warning terms. Russia has not consistently conveyed that this is a type of conflict where they would consider using nuclear weapons, but Russia has, in the entire post-Cold War period, consistently conveyed that in a large-scale conventional war with NATO, they would consider using nuclear weapons. The second example from the Ukraine war that I'll want to illuminate is that of an immediate warning success and an immediate warning, deterrence failure relating to the invasion itself. The key indicators used for warning the Russian aggression in Ukraine was the conventional force buildup, as we've talked about in the previous panel as well, and other preparatory measures. Recall the debate on blood reserves that Shashank was referring to earlier. Recall also the exercise that Shashank was referring to that produced differentiated warning with regard to whether a full-scale invasion was actually on the books. So in other words, sometime between 2021 and 2022, the warning problem of Ukraine transforms from one of general deterrence warning to one of immediate deterrence warning. By this time, the indicators all start pointing to the deliberation of an actual invasion, where the deterrence deliberation becomes what we could do to dissuade them, and the warning deliberation becomes will they or won't they and when. Professor Walton raised the issue of the open communication of the immediate warning success and whether or not that actually swayed, or what the intended effect of that communication was, which is an open debate. And Professor Goodman also referred to this issue in the context of the Iraq-Kuwait incident, where it's quite difficult to determine precisely whether this was a warning success, this was a deterrence success, and how we can know for sure. Finally, this case also demonstrates an example of a potentially undeterrable adversary in the context of whether it would have been possible to do anything to deter Russia as an adversary. This also makes the debate, I think, about whether or not Russia would be deterred from attacking a NATO state into one that comprises significantly different deliberations from the Ukraine context. And the final example I'll draw on finally is one that can be comprised as an immediate deterrent success and a warning success, potentially relating to Russian nuclear use in Ukraine, and whether they have been seriously deliberated in Russia. The New York Times reported on Russian generals deliberating nuclear weapons use at a point at which everyone else was also deliberating potential Russian nuclear weapons use in Ukraine, and whether the US efforts to dissuade Russia, or whether Chinese efforts to dissuade Russia or other factors potentially impacted the Russian deliberations are, again, extremely difficult to know for sure, but it remains a fact, of course, that Russia has not crossed the nuclear threshold in Ukraine. Whether this can be deemed a deterrent success is quite difficult, as is always the case with deterrence. You would need to know that the adversary had actually and actively planned to do something and then caved because of the types of threats that you made. But we could also potentially construe this as a warning success, given the reporting that I just referred to, i.e., we would need to know that kind, or have that kind of information, that type of intelligence, in order to actively reach out and actively dissuade the actor or the interlocutor from actually carrying out the aggression that he was contemplating. So to conclude, it seems from some preliminary observations at least that successful warning is a necessary requirement for effective immediate deterrence, whereas successful warning is not necessarily a sufficient or necessary requirement for effective general deterrence. Thank you.